All in the golden afternoon, full leisurely we glide, for both our oars with little skill by little arms are plied, while little hands make vain pretence our wanderings to guide.
The Reverend Charles Lutwidge Dodson was a young mathematics don at Christ Church, Oxford, when he first met Alice Liddell and her sisters. They were the small daughters of the new dean, an eminent classical scholar and former headmaster of Westminster School. Lorena was 6, Alice nearly 4, and Edith 2, when they made their first appearance in Dodson's diary.
(1856), April 25th, Friday. Went over with Southey in the afternoon to the deanery to try and take a photograph of the cathedral. The 3 little girls were in the garden most of the time, and we became excellent friends. We tried to group them in the foreground of the picture, but they were not patient sitters.
A small room next to the library at Christ Church, which Dodson occupied as sub-librarian, looks out over the lawn and flower beds of the deanery garden, where the 3 sisters and their elder brother Harry were often to be seen playing. When Dodson first started experimenting with photography, he tried many different subjects, but his most successful photographs were of children, and the lively, intelligent and attractive young Liddles made ideal subjects. In his college rooms, he kept a stock of dressing-up clothes, in which they often posed for pictures. Alice later recalled that, when we were thoroughly happy and amused at Mr. Dodson's stories, he used to pose us and expose the plates before the right mood had passed. Alice, Dodson's favourite, was dark-haired and blue-eyed, with a strikingly gentle and innocent face. In the library at Christ Church, several studies of her and her sisters are preserved in Dodson's original heavy glass negatives. The poet laureate, Alfred Tennyson, thought the photograph of Alice dressed as a beggar girl the most beautiful he had ever seen.
1862, July the 4th. Duckworth and I made an expedition up the river to Godstow with the 3 Liddles. We had tea on the bank there and did not reach Christchurch again till 8:15, on which occasion I told them the fairy story of Alice's adventures underground. Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. And where is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations? So she was considering in her own mind, as well as she could, for the hot day made her feel very sleepy and stupid, whether the pleasure of making a daisy chain was worth the trouble of getting up and picking the daisies, when a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. Took a watch out of its waistcoat pocket, looked at it, and then hurried on. Alice started to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it.
Dodson had an apparently endless fund of stories with which he would amuse the children when they visited his rooms or went with him on river picnics. But Alice was particularly taken with this new tale of her adventures underground and implored him to write it out for her. According to his friend Robinson Duckworth, who had helped with the rowing on this particular expedition, Dodson sat up nearly all night, writing down all he could remember of the story. Alice was not to receive it, however, until over 2 years later, in November 1864, when the finished manuscript, bound in dark green Morocco leather as a little book of 90 pages, was presented to her as an early Christmas present, with a beautifully designed and coloured title page and the dedication to a dear child in memory of a summer day. It is now, more than a century later, part of the manuscript collections of the British Library.
This extensive story was, at the request of Miss Alice Liddell, written out for her in manuscript print, with pen and ink pictures, such pictures, of my own devising, without the least idea at the time that it would ever be published.
Dodson wrote out the text of the story first of all, in sepia-coloured ink, leaving spaces for the 37 illustrations, 14 of them full page, which took him some time to complete, for he was completely untrained as an artist. He borrowed from the deanery a book of natural history to help him with the animal subjects. The infinite trouble he took over the task can be seen in the pages of child sketches preserved in the library at Christchurch. Some of the comic illustrations in the manuscript have a distinctly Edward Lear-like quality and recall Dodson's lively childhood drawings for family magazines.
"You are old," said the youth, "and your jaws are too weak for anything tougher than suet. Yet you ate all the goose, with the bones and the beak. Pray, how did you manage to do it?" "In my youth," said the old man, "I took to the law, and argued each case with my wife, and the muscular strength which it gave to my jaw has lasted the rest of my life."
At the very end of his little book, Dodson made a small drawing of the real Alice, copied from a photograph. This is in fact his only surviving drawing of her, but he must have been dissatisfied with it because he pasted the oval photograph over the top. It was discovered only fairly recently, in 1977, when an American scholar, Morton Cohen, persuaded the British Library to lift the photograph. It is now attached by a paper hinge so that the drawing can be seen beneath it. After persuasion from friends and their children, who had been shown the manuscript, Dodson decided to prepare the story for publication. And so, as he later explained, it was rewritten and enlarged, with 2 completely new chapters and most of the private family jokes and references removed. Growing from 18,000 to 35,000 words in the process, it was finally issued by Macmillan and Company on July the 4th, 1865, the 3rd anniversary of the original river trip. It was published under the pseudonym Lewis Carroll, which Dodson had used before in sending contributions to comic journals, and retitled Alice's Adventures in Wonderland.
1864, May the 2nd. Sent Tenniel the first piece of slip set up for Alice's Adventures from the beginning of Chapter 3. Photographed Professor Price's children. 1865, May the 26th. Received from Macmillan a copy, blank all but the first sheet, of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, bound in red cloth as a specimen.
There is in the British Library a letter from Dodson to Tom Taylor, the editor of Punch, dated June the 10th, 1864, in which he asks for help in fixing on a name for my fairy tale, having decided that the original underground title would not do. He lists several possibilities: Alice Among the Elves, or Goblins, Alice's Hour, or Doings, or Adventures in Elfland, or Wonderland. The mention of goblins might seem strange, since they do not appear in the story, but goblin faces are to be found in Dodson's early sketches for the original version in Christchurch Library. It was Tom Taylor who introduced Dodson to John Tenniel, a regular Punch cartoonist, who agreed to illustrate the published book, Dodson having come to the reluctant conclusion that his own drawings were not good enough.
1864, October the 12th. Called on Macmillan and had some talk about the book. Thence I went to Tenniel's, who showed me one drawing on wood of Alice sitting by the pool of tears and the rabbit hurrying away. We discussed the book and agreed on about 34 pictures.
Tenniel was invited to Oxford to explore the background to the story, the familiar scenes and objects which, consciously or unconsciously, Dodson had woven into his magic tale.
"Curiouser and curiouser," cried Alice. She was so surprised that she quite forgot how to speak good English. "Now I'm opening out like the largest telescope that ever was. Goodbye, feet." For when she looked down at her feet, they seemed almost out of sight. They were getting so far off.
Tenniel clearly based some of his illustrations on Dodson's original drawings, but in illustrating the new episodes which appeared in the expanded story, he had more of a free hand.
"Please, would you tell me," said Alice a little timidly, for she was not quite sure whether it was good manners for her to speak first, "why your cat grins like that?" "It's a Cheshire cat," said the Duchess, "and that's why. Pig!" She said the last word with such sudden violence that Alice quite jumped. But she saw in another moment that it was addressed to the baby and not to her.
The Cheshire Cat, a completely new character, is shown in Tenniel's drawing sitting on the branch of a tree very like the large chestnut tree in the Deanery garden, where Alice's own tabby cat, Dinah, was often to be found. Dodson was an extreme perfectionist, and working with him could be rather a wearing experience. He wanted to be closely involved in every aspect of his book at each stage of its production. Christchurch Library still possesses his elaborate plan of the illustrations, showing exactly what size they should be and how they should be set into the text. Several designs for the title page and the opening of Chapter 1, proof pages of the original story, and a carefully pasted mock-up of the new Mouse's Tale poem, which Macmillan's had originally set in a stiff, straight line.
Fury said to a mouse that he met in the house, "Let us both go to law. I will prosecute you. Come, I'll take no denial. We must have a trial, for really this morning I've nothing to do."
The British Library possesses one of the very few surviving copies of the first edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, now known as the suppressed edition, because when it at last appeared in July 1865, Tenniel announced that he was unhappy with the printing of the pictures, and Dodson decided that the whole edition should at once be withdrawn. The fault was in fact very slight. Some of the blocks had been printed rather lightly.
1865, July the 20th. Called on Macmillan and showed him Tenniel's letter about the fairy tale. He is entirely dissatisfied with the printing of the pictures, and I suppose we shall have to do it all again.
A new English first edition, completely reset, was published in November 1865, although, a common practice at that time, the date on the title page is given as 1866.
1865, November the 9th. Received from Macmillan a copy of the new impression of Alice, very far superior to the old, and in fact a perfect piece of artistic printing.
The book's success was almost instantaneous. Dodson kept a careful record in his diary of the early newspaper reviews. By the end of 1866, it was being reprinted, and by 1870 sales had reached 25,000. Many more editions followed, and there were translations, some supervised by Dodson himself, into several languages. By 1898, the year of his death, 86,000 copies had been sold in Britain alone. Dodson's last photograph of Alice Liddell was taken in 1870, when she was 18 years old. The sequel to Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, which he referred to as the second volume of Alice, was published 2 years later, with a dedicatory poem to the child of the pure unclouded brow he so fondly remembered.
I have not seen thy sunny face, nor heard thy silver laughter, no thought of me shall find a place in thy young life's hereafter. Enough that now thou wilt not fail to listen to my fairy tale.
13 years later, Dodson wrote to Alice Liddell that was, as he described her in his diary, now Mrs. Reginald Hargreaves.
Christchurch, Oxford, March the 1st, 1885. My dear Mrs. Hargreaves, I fancy this will come to you almost like a voice from the dead after so many years of silence, but my mental picture is as vivid as ever of one who was, through so many years, my ideal child friend. What I want to ask is whether you have any objection to the original manuscript book of Alice's adventures, which I suppose you still possess, being published in facsimile. I think, considering the extraordinary popularity the books have had, we have sold more than 120,000 of the two, there must be many who would like to see the original form. Always your friend, C.L. Dodson.
Alice's own copy of the facsimile volume, which eventually appeared just in time for Christmas 1886, is now in Christchurch Library. She continued to treasure the original manuscript until 1928, when, aged 75, widowed, and faced with substantial death duties, she reluctantly put it up for auction at Sotheby's in London. The sale was on the 3rd of April, and Alice herself attended to see the book purchased for £15,400, a record price at that time, by an American dealer, Dr. Rosenbach, who took it back with him to Philadelphia and resold it at almost twice the price to a wealthy American collector. In Christchurch Library, there is a collection of press cuttings and a letter from Alice to her son, Carol Hargreaves, excitedly describing the events of the auction day. Alice herself visited America in 1932 to attend the Lewis Carroll centenary celebrations in New York, where she was guest of honor. While she was there, she celebrated her 80th birthday, and Columbia University created her a Doctor of Literature. She died 2 years later, in 1934. In 1946, following the death of its new owner, the manuscript was again sold at auction in New York to a group of Americans, headed by the Librarian of Congress. They presented it to the Manuscript Department of the British Museum, now part of the British Library, in 1948, as a gesture of thanks for Britain's part in fighting the Second World War. It is still on display in the library's exhibition galleries. Visitors from all over the world continue to flock to Christchurch in search of Lewis Carroll and Alice. Dodson's sitting room is now a graduate common room. Its original appearance is preserved only in a photograph taken after his death in 1898. His William de Morgan fireplace tiles, much admired by young visitors, with their strange creatures reminiscent of Wonderland, have been made into a fire screen which is now in the senior common room. In the great hall, where one of the stained glass windows is dedicated to Dodson and Alice, hangs a rather sombre portrait, painted after Dodson's death from a photograph. Alice's younger sister Edith, who died suddenly and tragically at the age of 22, is commemorated as St. Catherine in a memorial window by Burne-Jones in the cathedral. But it is in the library that we come closest to Dodson and his ideal child friend. Alice's son Carol Hargreaves' collection of hundreds of editions of the Wonderland and Looking Glass stories in many languages is on loan to the college, with a fascinating collection of children's toys, games, and Alice memorabilia. There is also a group of the real Alice's most treasured possessions, some of them strangely evocative of the fairy tale of long ago.
Thus grew the tale of Wonderland. Thus, slowly, one by one, its quaint events were hammered out, and now the tale is done, and home we steer, a merry crew, beneath the setting sun.